On November 3, 1871, at the Rail End Camp above Blue Canyon, California, a 20-year-old woman named Mei Lin was walked across a plank floor to settle her father's debt of $300 to a labor broker named Otis Crane. She carried a jade pendant sewn into her sleeve and nothing else that was truly hers. Crane held the paper that named her a laundry keeper, bound to the camp for 3 years. And in a camp where the broker's word was the only law that mattered, that paper was absolute. Every man in the mess tent expected her to end up in Crane's own tent by the second week. That was what happened to women who arrived at the end of the line with a debt on their back and no English to argue it. What a quiet, sun-scarred foreman named Jonas Reeve did instead, on the very night she arrived, made Crane fold the paper back into his coat without a word. Everyone in that tent agreed she had been handed a burden to some unlucky man, a debt with a face, nothing more, and they said so in front of her, certain she understood nothing. Crane read her name off the paper wrong twice, called her girl the third time, and did not try again. Jonas Reeve had not spoken since she arrived. He ran the grading crew that blasted the shelf road above the canyon, a man the camp called solitary because he ate alone and judged nobody by where they had come from, only by what their hands could do by sundown. When Crane finally shoved the paper toward him to countersign the labor transfer, Reeve asked one question before he picked up the pen. Not her price, not her age, but her name, spoken slowly enough that she could correct his pronunciation. The tent went quiet at that. Crane laughed once, short and startled, the way a man laughs when he has misjudged the room. Mei Lin gave her name a second time, clearer, and watched the foreman write it correctly on the line, where the broker had only ever written, "the Chinese girl." Whatever came next in that camp, one man had already refused to let her arrive as cargo. She was given a lean-to behind the cook shack that had housed sacks of flour until that morning, and she swept it herself before anyone thought to offer. The camp's laundry line already belonged to a Welsh widow named Bronwyn Hale, who eyed the new arrival the way she eyed a crew short one man before a blast, as extra weight nobody had asked her to carry. Mei Lin did not argue. She hung her single spare dress beside the widow's linens, set her jade pendant against her collarbone where it could not be seen, and by the second morning had the whole line dry, an hour before the mess bell, using a trick of hanging the heavy canvas trousers inside out that Bronwyn had never thought to try. The widow said nothing about it, but she moved her own basket 6 inches closer to Mei Lin's the next day, and in a camp that measured trust in inches, that was not nothing. Reeve came by twice that week, never to speak, only to leave a bucket already filled at the lean-to door, so she would not have to walk to the creek alone after dark. She noticed. She did not know yet what to make of a man who gave help and asked for no thanks, because every man who had touched her life before had wanted something plainly stated. The not asking was its own kind of question, and she carried it with her into the second week the way she carried the pendant, close and unexplained. The camp doctor was 3 days' ride away in Dutch Flat and came only for broken bones the bone setter could not set, which meant every fever, every burn from the powder cruise, every winter cough that turned to something worse, was left to whatever the camp itself could manage. In the third week, a boy no older than 12, the son of the camp's Chinese cook, went white and shaking with a fever that the bone setter called lung sickness and had no remedy for beyond bed rest and prayer. Mei Lin had watched her mother treat exactly this sickness twice in Toishan. With a bark and root mixture her mother had ground by hand every winter of her childhood, and she had a small paper packet of dried herbs sewn into the same sleeve that hid her pendant, brought from home because her mother had insisted she never travel without them. She said nothing to Bronwyn or to Reeve. She only asked the cook, in the few English words she had, and more gesture than language, whether she could try. He was desperate enough to let a stranger touch his son. Nobody in that camp, watching a laundry keeper mix bark into hot water over the cook's own fire, expected it to matter. Everyone assumed the boy's fever would break on its own by spring, or it would not break at all, and there was nothing to be done either way but wait. She was already boiling the water before she let herself wonder what would happen to her position in that camp if the boy did not wake by morning. The boy's fever broke before the mess bell rang the next morning, and by the time the camp doctor's absence would ordinarily have been felt as a small daily grief, it was instead simply not felt at all. The cook came to the lean-to behind the flour shack with 2 eggs wrapped in a cloth, more than he could spare, and pressed them into her hands without a word, because he did not have the English to thank her properly, and she did not yet have enough to accept the thanks properly, so the exchange happened in the old way, through objects instead of speech. Word moved through a mining camp faster than any letter could travel, carried on the backs of men walking from the cook tent to the grading crew to the assayer's counter, and by evening 3 more people had found reasons to pass near the flour shack that had nothing to do with laundry. A powder man with a burn on his forearm that would not close, a teamster whose horse had thrown a shoe into his shin, an old prospector, half-deaf, who simply wanted to see the woman who had pulled a boy back from lung sickness with nothing but bark and hot water. Mei Lin treated the burn with a poultice her mother had taught her for exactly this kind of wound, packed the teamster's shin with a wrap tight enough to let him walk without favoring it, and gave the old man tea because there was nothing wrong with him that Tea and Company would not fix. She did not charge for any of it. She did not know yet what the camp's economy would let her charge, and she was not willing to find out by guessing wrong. Otis Crane heard about the boy on the second day, the way he heard about everything eventually, and he came to the flour shack not to thank her but to remind her, in the flat voice of a man reading from a ledger even when he held no paper, that her contract said laundry keeper and named nothing about doctoring, and that whatever she did with her hours outside the wash line was her business only so long as it did not interfere with the line itself. It was not a threat exactly, it was worse than a threat, because it was indifference dressed as rule-keeping, the reminder that in his eyes she remained a term in a contract and nothing more, regardless of what she had done with a dying boy's fever. She listened to the whole of it with her eyes down, the posture that had kept her safe on the ship and on the wagon road up from Sacramento, and when he left, she found that her hands were shaking in a way they had not shaken while she ground the bark. That night, Jonas Reeve left another bucket at her door, already full, and this time a second object sat beside it, a small tin of salve the company store sold to the powder crews for burns, left without a note, without a knock, without anything that could be mistaken for a claim on her attention. She understood the gift for what it was before she understood why it unsettled her more than Crane's warning had. Crane wanted nothing from her but obedience to a paper. Reeves seemed to want nothing from her at all, and she had not yet learned what a man who wanted nothing might eventually ask for instead. December came down off the Sierra crest in a single hard week, the kind of cold that turned the creek's edges to lace, and made the grading crew's picks ring different against frozen ground. Mei Lin had never seen snow settle the way it settled here, silent and total, burying the tent city until only the smoke of cook fires marked where the camp still lived underneath it. She had grown up somewhere the winters were wet and gray and never white, and the first morning she woke to snow on the flour shack's canvas roof, she stood outside longer than the cold should have allowed, watching her own breath turn visible in a way it had never done at home. Bronwyn Hale found her there and, without translating a single word of explanation, handed her a second shawl from her own trunk, the wool rough and smelling of cedar, and went back to breaking ice off the wash basins as though the gesture required no acknowledgement. It was the first thing the widow had given her outright rather than simply tolerated beside her own, and Mei Lin understood it as the inches of trust finally closing into a foot. The cold changed the shape of the camp's days. Laundry that had dried in an afternoon now took 3, hung near the cook fire instead of on the open line, which meant Mei Lin spent long hours inside the cook tent where the camp's men drifted through for coffee and stayed for the warmth, and where she began, without quite planning to, learning English the way a child learns it, by ear, by repetition, by the shape a word made in a stranger's mouth before she understood its meaning. Jonas Reeve was one of the men who drifted through, not for coffee, since he rarely drank it, but because the grading crew's tools needed mending near the fire's heat, and he worked with his hands close enough to her that she began picking out his words before anyone else's, perhaps because he spoke slowly, without seeming to slow down for her benefit, the way a patient man simply speaks. He asked her one evening, in the plain words he always used, what the pendant at her collar was, the first time anyone in the camp had noticed it enough to ask rather than assume. She told him, haltingly, that it had been her grandmother's, that jade like this was buried with the dead in her country because it was believed to protect the body on its journey, and that she wore it because she had not been able to bring anything else that connected her to the people who had raised her. He listened to the whole halting explanation without interrupting, and when she finished he said only that it sounded like it was worth more than anything in Crane's ledger, a sentence so plain and so exactly true that she found herself turning back to the wash basin to hide what her face was doing. Outside, the snow kept falling on a camp that had not yet decided what to make of her, and inside the cook tent, for the length of one conversation about a pendant, she had stopped being a term in a contract and simply been a woman with a grandmother, and she did not know how to hold both of those facts at once. The camp's only store belonged to a man named Silas Pruitt, who sold flour, powder, boots, and the small comforts a mining camp could not do without, and who had made it plain from Mei Lin's first week that his shelves were not open to her custom. He did not say it outright the first time. He simply found reasons her coin was short, or her order misheard, or his stock exhausted the moment she stepped through the door, reasons that evaporated the instant the next customer in line was white. Bronwyn had warned her of it before she ever tried. In the clipped, practical way the widow delivered anything unpleasant, so that Mei Lin went to the store the first time already braced, and left the first time already unsurprised. What she needed most was salt, dried beans, and needles for mending. None of it exotic. All of it ordinary enough that its refusal could only be read one way. She began instead trading directly with the camp's other outsiders, the teamster who owed her for his shin, the powder man whose burn she had dressed, exchanging her herb work and her mending hands for what she needed, without Pruitt's counter ever entering the transaction, and in this way she built, without naming it as such, a second economy running quietly alongside the official one, invisible to Crane's ledger, and unbothered by Pruitt's discretion. It could not supply everything. Needles wore down, thread ran short, the dried herbs she had carried from home, rationed since the ship, were beginning to thin in their paper packets, and there was no source for more of them within 100 miles that she knew of. She began instead studying what grew wild on the hillsides above the camp, the resinous shrubs and the bitter-rooted plants the miners cursed as weeds, testing small amounts on herself first the way her mother had taught her to test anything unfamiliar, cataloging what eased a cough and what did nothing, and what, once, made her own stomach turn for a full day as a lesson in caution. Jonas Reeve found her on the hillside one gray afternoon with her sleeves rolled and dirt under her nails, gathering a root she did not yet have a use for, and instead of asking what she was doing, he simply crouched beside her and asked which plants she wanted more of, because his crew cleared brush from the grading line every week and could as easily set it aside as burn it. It was the kind of offer that cost him nothing and meant everything. The difference between a man who watched her solve problems from a distance and a man who picked up a shovel to help her solve the next one. And when she told him, he repeated the names back to her carefully, mangling the Cantonese, and then trying again, until she nodded that he had it close enough. That evening a sack of cleared brush appeared outside the flower shack, sorted, she would later realize, by someone who had actually looked at each plant before tossing it in, rather than simply hauling whatever came to hand, and she understood that Jonas Reeve was not a man who did anything by half measure, which frightened her slightly more than Crane's coldness ever had, because coldness asked nothing of her, and this asked her to imagine what came after gratitude. News reached the camp in January that the assayer, a company man named Corwin Ames, who weighed every ounce of gold dust that passed through Blue Canyon and took his cut before the miners took theirs, had begun refusing to weigh dust brought in by two of the camp's few Chinese placer workers, men who worked a modest claim on the creek's upper bend and had done so without incident for over a year. Ames offered no reason beyond a shrug and a claim that his scales were reserved for the camp's regular custom, a word that did a great deal of quiet work in excluding exactly the men it was aimed at. Mei Lin heard about it from the cook, who heard it from one of the placer workers directly, a man named Fong who came to the cook tent that evening looking for advice from anyone who might have it, since he had nowhere official to bring the grievance, and no one official who would hear it if he did. She listened to the whole account, and something in her hardened that had nothing to do with fear. Her father had kept the accounts for a merchant house in Toishan before the debts that sent her across an ocean, and he had taught her, in the years before everything fell apart, how a ledger could be made to lie as easily as it could be made to tell the truth, which numbers a dishonest clerk shaded, and which he left alone to preserve the appearance of fairness. She asked Fong to bring her his dust the next morning, weighed first on the crude balance the cook tent used for flour rations, a number she wrote down herself in a hand she was still teaching to form English numerals. When Ames's scale returned a figure 11% lower than her own for the same dust, she did not confront him herself, understanding without being told that a Chinese laundry keeper accusing the camp's assayer of theft would be heard as nothing at all. She brought the discrepancy instead to Jonas Reeve, laying out both numbers on a scrap of paper with a patience that cost her more than it showed, and watched him go still in the particular way she had learned meant he was angry, without intending to show it. He did not go to Ames. He went to the mine's owner, a man who visited the camp only twice a season and who cared a great deal more about a cheating assayer stealing from the operation's own reported yields than about which miners were being shorted. And within a week, Ames was gone from Blue Canyon entirely, replaced by a man who weighed every claim the same. Fong never learned exactly how the correction had happened, only that it had, and Mei Lin never told him her part in it, because she had learned already that credit given too visibly could cost more than it earned. But she had proven something to herself on that scrap of paper that no one could take back, that the skill her father had given her, a skill she had once thought belonged only to the life she'd lost, still had weight in this one. By February, the camp had begun, in the grudging way such places absorb what they cannot dismiss, to treat Mei Lin as something more than a term in Crane's ledger, though the shift showed itself in small transactions rather than any open welcome. The cook now called her by name without correction. The teamster's wife, newly arrived from Sacramento and unused to camp life, sought her out for advice on keeping bread from freezing overnight, a question Mei Lin answered with more warmth than the question strictly required, grateful for the simple normalcy of being asked something that had nothing to do with medicine or debt. Bronwyn Hale had taken to sharing her fire outright rather than merely tolerating a shared line, and the two women worked most mornings now in a companionable near silence that needed little translation, since laundry, unlike conversation, required no shared language to accomplish together. It was into this fragile, improving order that Otis Crane reintroduced himself, arriving at the flower shack on a bright, hard-frozen morning with a different kind of paper than the one he had carried in November. This one was a request from a camp 2 ridges over, a larger operation with its own laundry keeper freshly quit, offering Crane a price for Mei Lin's remaining contract years that exceeded what Blue Canyon paid him for her labor by a considerable margin. He explained this to her the way he explained everything, as arithmetic rather than cruelty, a business transaction in which her preferences were not a relevant variable, and he informed her, not asked her, that she would be transferred within the week. Mei Lin's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She had built in 3 months the first ground under her feet that felt remotely her own, the cook tent, Bronwyn's fire, the hillside where she gathered roots, the quiet, careful attention of a foreman who left buckets at her door, and Crane proposed to erase all of it with the same indifferent economy that had first walked her across a plank floor to settle her father's debt. She did not cry in front of him. She had learned on the ship that tears bought her nothing from men who dealt in paper, and she held her face still while he explained the transfer's terms, and only after he left did she sit down hard on the edge of her cot, with her hands pressed flat against her knees, breathing the way her mother had once taught her to breathe, through pain that could not be stopped by wanting it to stop. Word of the transfer moved through the camp before the day was out, the way all news moved through Blue Canyon, and by evening the cook tent was quieter than she had ever known it, men glancing at her and then away, uncertain what, if anything, could be done about a decision made 2 ridges over by men none of them had any standing to argue with. She understood, sitting in that unusual quiet, that whatever came next was not hers to decide, and that understanding sat in her chest heavier than the cold outside ever had. Jonas Reeve heard about the transfer from the cook before Mei Lin had gathered the nerve to tell him herself, and he came to the flower shack that same night, later than he had ever come before, his knock so quiet she almost mistook it for wind against canvas. He did not ask her whether the transfer was true. He asked what the buying camp had offered Crane, a question so precisely practical that it took her a moment to understand it was not coldness, but the opening move of a man already calculating something. She told him the figure as best she understood it, and he was silent long enough that she began to wonder if he had come only to confirm the arithmetic of a loss neither of them could prevent. Then he told her, in the plain, unhurried way he told her everything, that he intended to match it. Not for the mine, not for Blue Canyon's operation, which had no formal need of a laundry keeper's contract one way or another, but for himself, out of 3 years of a foreman's saved wages that he had never spent on anything beyond his own keep, because he had never before found anything in a mining camp worth spending them on. Mei Lin did not understand at first that he meant to buy the debt outright, to become, on paper, exactly the kind of man who held her contract, and when the meaning landed she felt something colder than Crane's arithmetic move through her, because she had seen this shape before, a man paying money for the right to decide what happened to her next, and it did not matter to that cold, frightened part of her whether the man's intentions were gentle. She asked him, in words sharper than she had ever used with him, whether he understood what he was proposing to become. He did not flinch from the question. He said that he did understand it, and that he had thought of little else since hearing the news, and that the only difference he could offer her, the only thing that made the transaction bearable to his own conscience, was that he intended to tear the paper the moment it was signed over to him, in front of witnesses, so that no contract would exist to be sold again by anyone, ever, to anywhere. He was not offering to own her. He was offering to buy her out of a system that treated her as ownable, and then to remove himself from that system entirely by destroying the instrument that made it possible. It was, she realized slowly, turning the idea over with the same caution she gave an unfamiliar root before tasting it, not a rescue in the shape she had feared. It was closer to a door being unlocked and left open, with no one standing in the frame expecting her to walk through it toward him specifically. She told him she needed to think, and he said that of course she did, and he left without another word, and she sat awake long past the cold settling deep enough to numb her hands, turning the offer over and over, unable yet to tell the difference between being saved and being claimed, only certain that for the first time since the plank floor in November, someone had asked what she wanted before deciding what would happen to her. She did not answer him the next morning, or the morning after that. Instead, she went to Bronwyn Hale, because there was no one else in the camp whose judgment she trusted enough to test her own thinking against, and because the widow had buried a husband in a mining accident 2 winters before, and understood better than anyone in Blue Canyon what it meant to have a man's decisions determine the whole shape of a woman's life. Bronwyn listened to the entire account without interrupting, her hands never stopping their work at the wash basin, and when Maylin finished, the widow said only that she had known Jonas Reeve for 4 years and had never once seen him do a single thing for show. It was not effusive praise. It was, from Bronwyn, the strongest character reference the camp could produce, and Maylin turned the sentence over the same way she turned over an unfamiliar root, looking for the bitterness hidden under the surface, and finding, to her mild surprise, none. She thought of her father, who had once been a man of some standing before the debts, and of the marriage he had arranged for her before the ship, a transaction not so different in its bones from what Crane had first proposed, except that the man in Toyshan had wanted a wife the way a merchant wants inventory, useful, presentable, replaceable. She thought of the plank floor, of Crane reading her name wrong twice, of the 11% theft on Fong's gold dust, of every calculation in this new country that had priced her without asking what she thought she was worth. And she thought of a bucket left full at her door on a night she had not asked for one, of a sack of sorted brush, of a man who had listened to an explanation of a jade pendant and said only that it was worth more than anything in a ledger. The difference, she decided, walking the frozen creek path alone that afternoon with her hands buried in Bronwyn's borrowed shawl, was not that Jonas Reeve wanted nothing from her. It was that whatever he wanted, he was prepared to want it without the paper, without the leverage, without any instrument that could compel her answer to be what he hoped it would be. That was not the shape of ownership she had feared. It was closer to the shape of a question honestly asked, one she was finally, for the first time since November, free to answer on her own terms. She found him at the grading line as the light was failing, breaking frozen ground with the rest of his crew, and she did not make him wait for the walk back to camp. She told him, there on the half-blasted shelf road with granite dust still settling around them, that he could buy the paper on the single condition that he tear it in front of the whole camp at the mess tent, where everyone who had watched her arrive as cargo would watch her leave that status behind in the same place. He set down his tools without a word and looked at her the way a man looks at ground he has just realized is worth more than he priced it. Crane did not make the sale easy, not out of any residual claim on Maylin's welfare, but because he had scented, correctly, that Reeve wanted the paper badly enough to overpay for it, and a man like Crane treated another man's want as simply the opening figure in a negotiation. He drew the transaction out over 4 days, inventing small obstacles, a missing signature from the buying camp releasing their claim, a fee he had not mentioned before, each delay calculated to test how far Reeve's patience and pocket would stretch. Reeve paid every figure without visible anger, though Maylin, watching from the edges of these exchanges, could see the muscle working in his jaw each time Crane produced a new number, and she understood that he was spending more than money, that some private ledger of his own dignity was being drawn down with every concession, and that he was choosing to pay it anyway, rather than let the negotiation collapse and leave her contract in Crane's hands one day longer than necessary. On the fourth evening, Crane finally produced the transfer paper, fully signed, fully binding, and completely Reeves to do with as he pleased, and he handed it over in the mess tent doorway with the small, satisfied smile of a man who believed he had won, regardless of who held the paper afterward, because in his accounting, a fool who paid too much was still a fool, and fools were always worth doing business with again. Word had already moved through the camp about what would happen next, and by the time Reeves stepped fully into the mess tent with the paper in his hand, nearly every soul in Blue Canyon who was not on a shift underground had crowded inside or pressed against the canvas walls to watch. Bronwyn at the front with her arms crossed, the cook and his fever-recovered son near the fire, Fong and the other placer miners close by the door, as though they did not quite trust themselves to stand further in. Mei Lin stood beside the center post, her pendant visible at her collar for the first time in the open, because she had decided that morning that whatever else changed tonight, she would not hide it any longer. Reeve did not make a speech. He held the paper up once, so the lamplight caught the ink plainly enough that no one could later claim confusion about what it said, and then he tore it, not in a single dramatic rip, but in slow, deliberate halves and quarters, the sound of it strangely loud in a tent gone otherwise silent, until the paper was reduced to a handful of pieces too small to reassemble into any claim on anyone. He did not hand the pieces to her as a gift or a trophy. He dropped them into the mess tent's iron stove himself, where they caught and were gone in seconds, and only then did he turn to the room and say, in the plainest voice he owned, that Mei Lin owed no one in that camp anything, not him, not Crane, not the ledger that had brought her here, and that anyone who treated her otherwise would answer to him personally. Crane's satisfied smile had not survived the burning. He left the tent before the ash had settled, and the camp, for a long moment afterward, did not quite know what to do with its own silence. The camp did not celebrate what had happened in the mess tent, not exactly, and Mei Lin had not expected celebration, only relief, and even that arrived slowly and unevenly across different faces over the following days. What she had not expected, and what caught her flat-footed the way the first real snowstorm had caught her that December, was the resentment that surfaced in its place among a portion of the camp that had watched the burning and decided it did not like what it implied about the order of things. Silas Pruitt's refusal to sell to her, which had operated quietly for months as an unspoken policy, hardened after the burning into something he no longer bothered to disguise, and he told the cook, loudly enough to be overheard by exactly the people he intended to overhear it, that he did not care what paper Reeve tore up in front of a crowd. Some people did not belong at a white man's counter, and never would regardless of whose contract they carried or didn't. A handful of the newer miners, men who had arrived in the last 2 months and had no memory of the fever, the assayer's theft, or any of the months of small proofs that had slowly changed the camp's mind, began treating Reeve's public gesture as an insult to be answered rather than a debt settled, muttering about a foreman who had gone soft, who had let a laundry keeper make a fool of him in front of the whole operation, who could not be trusted on the grading line if he had already shown he'd trade 3 years of saved wages for a woman's contract on nothing but sentiment. Mei Lin heard fragments of it in the cook tent, in the way conversations stopped a beat too late when she entered, in the sudden interest certain men took in the weather whenever she passed. She had grown skilled, over 4 months, at reading a room's temperature without needing every word translated, and she read this one as clearly as she had read Crane's arithmetic in November. Some kinds of change a camp accepted the way it accepted weather, without argument, because there was no other choice, and other kinds it fought, quietly and by inches, precisely because a choice had been visibly made, and visible choices could be visibly reversed. The sheriff, a company appointee named Del Whitcomb, whose jurisdiction covered 3 camps along the grade, and whose salary was paid, in practice, by the same men who owned the claims, arrived in Blue Canyon that week on other business, and found time, while he was there, to have a quiet word with Reeve about the wisdom of stirring up trouble a camp this small could not afford to carry through a hard winter. He did not threaten anything specific. He did not need to. The suggestion that Reeve's choices might cost him standing with the men whose labor kept the grading line moving was threat enough, delivered in the mild, reasonable tone company men always used when they wanted a thing done without leaving fingerprints on the wanting. Mei Lin watched Reeve's face while Whitcomb spoke to him near the assayer's new scale, and she saw for the first time since the plank floor, real doubt cross it. Not doubt about her, she understood immediately, but doubt about whether 4 months and 1 burned paper had been enough to change a place built on exactly the arithmetic he had just refused to practice. The trouble, when it finally arrived in a shape sharper than muttering, came through the claim itself rather than through any direct confrontation with Mei Lin, which she would later understand was precisely the point, since a camp that could not attack her directly without answering to Reeve found it easier to attack the ground he stood on. A dispute surfaced over the boundary between Reeve's grading contract and a claim newly staked by one of the resentful newcomers, a man named Harlan Voss who had arrived with the others in the last 2 months and had said little to Mei Lin beyond what courtesy required, but who had been among the loudest in the cook tent about foremen gone soft. Voss produced a survey marker he claimed had always stood where he now placed it, shifting the disputed boundary 30 feet into ground Reeve's crew had already cleared and graded at considerable cost in powder and labor, and he took the dispute straight to the mine's owner rather than settling it campside the way such things were ordinarily settled, ensuring that Reeve would have to defend the boundary formally, on paper, in front of a man who visited twice a season and knew nothing of Blue Canyon's internal politics beyond what was reported to him. It was a small theft dressed as a technicality, 30 feet of already graded ground worth real money in saved labor, and it was transparent to nearly everyone in camp as retaliation, though transparent and provable were not the same thing, and Voss had chosen his ground carefully enough that proving it would require exactly the kind of documentation a grading crew rarely bothered to keep. Mei Lin, watching Reeve go through his own record books late into the night by lamplight, searching for anything that might establish the boundary's true history, recognized the shape of the problem immediately, because it was her father's old work in a new disguise, a ledger dispute that hinged not on what was true, but on what could be shown to be true, on paper, to a man predisposed to believe whichever party presented the cleaner record. She had spent 4 months quietly cataloging her own herb trials in a notebook Reeve himself had given her from the company store. Dates and measurements and outcomes recorded the way her father had taught her to record anything that might later need defending, and it was that habit, more than any specific expertise in surveying, that let her recognize what Reeve's crew had never thought to keep, a dated, witnessed record. She asked him whether the crew had marked their grading progress anywhere, even informally, and he said only that they marked it by memory and by the ground itself, the way graders always had, because no one had ever needed more than that before. She told him, with more certainty than she entirely felt, that memory would not survive contact with a company owner who had never seen the ground and trusted numbers over recollection, and that they had perhaps 2 weeks before the owner's next visit to build a record strong enough to outweigh Voss's marker. Reeve looked at her for a long moment across the lamplit table, the same look he had given her on the shelf road when she'd named her condition for the burning, and asked, quietly, whether she was offering to help him build it. She was offering exactly that, and for the next 12 days she worked the boundary dispute the way she had once watched her father work a merchant house's disputed accounts, methodically, without visible urgency, building a record too solid to argue with, rather than an argument too loud to ignore. She walked the graded ground herself, morning and evening, measuring distances by paces she had calibrated against a length of rope Reeve had marked for her, and she recorded each measurement against landmarks that could not be moved or disputed, the angle of a particular boulder, the distance from a specific stand of pine, details that meant nothing to a company owner unfamiliar with the terrain, but that she cross-referenced against the crew's own memory of where they had blasted first, second, and third, building a timeline that made physical sense in a way a single shifted marker could not. She interviewed, in her improving but still careful English, every man on the grading crew individually, away from the others, recording each account separately so that Voss could not later claim the crew had simply agreed on a story together, and she found, to her quiet satisfaction, that the accounts matched in every detail that mattered, because the men had genuinely graded where they said they had graded, and the truth, properly documented, did not need to be coached into consistency. Bronwyn contributed an unexpected piece of evidence, mentioning almost in passing that she had hung wash to dry on a line strung between 2 specific trees on the day the crew broke through to the disputed section, and that the date was fixed in her memory because it was also the day a supply wagon had arrived with letters from home, an event significant enough that she had marked it in the small diary she kept and had never before thought relevant to anything beyond her own correspondence. That single entry, cross-referenced against the supply wagon's own delivery log at the company's store, which Pruitt kept meticulously despite his refusal to sell to Mei Lin directly, gave the whole record a fixed date that could not be argued away as memory or collusion. Mei Lin assembled all of it into a single document in her own hand, translated where necessary into English clean enough that a stranger unfamiliar with the camp could follow it without confusion, dates and measurements, and witnessed accounts laid out with the same discipline her father had once applied to a merchant's books. And when she finally set it in front of Reeve 2 days before the owner's visit, he read it through twice in silence and then looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something closer to wonder than gratitude, as though he were only now fully understanding what kind of mind had been living quietly behind the flower shack's canvas wall since November. He told her, when he could finally speak, that whatever happened with Voss and the Boundary, this record alone had probably saved the crew more grief than she could know, because a foreman without proof was just a man with an opinion, and she had just handed him something no company owner could wave away as opinion. She allowed herself, for the first time in 4 months, to feel something like pride rather than mere relief, and she understood, turning the feeling over carefully, that it tasted different from the pride of surviving, sharper and warmer, both at once. The mine's owner, a brisk, unsentimental man named Walter Ainsworth, who arrived by wagon on a cold, clear morning with barely enough time budgeted for the visit to matter to him personally, listened to Voss present his shifted marker with the bored patience of a man who had heard 100 boundary disputes and expected this one to resolve the way most did, with an hour of argument and a coin flip disguised as judgment. He listened considerably less boredly when Reeve produced Mei Lin's document, laying it flat on the assayer's counter and walking Ainsworth through it point by point, the paced measurements, the individually witnessed crew accounts, the supply wagon's delivery log cross-referenced against Bronwyn's diary entry, a chain of evidence assembled with a precision Ainsworth admitted, reading it, he did not typically see from grading crews who kept their boundaries by memory and eyeball. He asked, partway through, who had compiled it, and Reeve did not hesitate before answering that his laundry keeper had, a description Ainsworth's eyebrows registered with open surprise before he returned his attention to the document itself, because whatever his private thoughts about the answer, the record in front of him was simply more convincing than a single shifted stake, and Ainsworth had not built a mining operation by letting his private thoughts override what the evidence plainly showed. He ruled the boundary stood where Reeve's crew had always graded it, ordered Voss to move his marker back to its documented position, and left within the hour, his business concluded to his satisfaction, and, Mei Lin suspected, without much further thought given to the woman who had made his decision easy. Voss took the ruling badly, though he had no standing left to contest it, and the resentment that had simmered since the mess tent burning found, in his humiliation, fresh fuel rather than any cooling. He did not confront Reeve directly, understanding by now that a direct confrontation favored a man with Reeve's standing and his own newly documented reputation for carelessness, but the muttering in certain corners of the camp did not stop, and Mei Lin noticed, in the days after Ainsworth's visit, a new edge to it. Less about Reeve going soft and more about a Chinese laundry keeper who had apparently made a fool of a company owner's judgment by proxy, a framing that unsettled her more than the original resentment had, because it recast her competence itself as the offense, rather than merely a footnote to Reeve's choices. Pruitt's counter remained closed to her. The churchwives, a small cluster of women married to the camp's more established men who held themselves apart from Bronwyn's rougher practicality, began a habit of crossing to the street's far side when Mei Lin approached, a silent verdict delivered without a single word that could be quoted back as insult. She had won the boundary dispute cleanly and completely, and she understood, walking back to the flower shack in Ainsworth's wagon dust, that winning cleanly had somehow made her more visible as a target rather than less, because a camp that could dismiss her as Reeve's soft-hearted charity case had just watched her outthink all of them, and some part of Blue Canyon was not prepared to forgive her for it. The church wives found their opportunity in February's coldest week, when the camp's small congregation, which met in the mess tent on Sundays under a circuit preacher who visited once a month, announced a charity supper to raise funds for the camp's first proper schoolhouse, an event that would draw families from 2 neighboring camps and represent, in miniature, Blue Canyon's claim to being something more than a rough collection of tents and claims. Mei Lin was not invited to help organize it, which did not surprise her, but she learned through Bronwyn, who had been invited precisely because her years in the camp had earned her a grudging place among the organizing women, that the planning committee had spent an uncomfortable half-hour debating, in Bronwyn's hearing, whether a Chinese woman's cooking should be permitted anywhere near the supper table at all, regardless of how skilled that cooking might be, a debate the committee's most vocal member, the wife of the company's paymaster, had settled by declaring plainly that some things simply were not done in a respectable camp, no matter what a foreman had torn up in a mess tent 2 months before. Bronwyn relayed the whole conversation to Mei Lin with visible anger, more anger than Mei Lin had ever seen the widow show, and Mei Lin found herself, oddly, calmer than Bronwyn was on her behalf, because this particular cruelty was at least an honest one, stated plainly enough that she knew exactly where she stood, rather than having to read it in crossed streets and closed counters. She told Bronwyn she did not intend to force her way into a supper that did not want her, and Bronwyn, still furious, said that was exactly the kind of quiet dignity that made her want to break something, and the two women sat together by the fire that evening in a silence that carried more solidarity than any argument could have. Jonas Reeve heard about the paymaster's wife's declaration the next morning, from Bronwyn directly, who made a point of finding him at the grading line specifically to tell him, and he said nothing in response beyond a short nod that Bronwyn would later describe to Mei Lin as the particular stillness he wore right before he did something the camp would remember. He did not confront the paymaster's wife. He went instead to the supper's organizing committee as a whole, 2 days before the event, and informed them, in the same plain voice he had used to burn a contract in front of the entire camp, that he would be attending the charity supper and that he would be bringing, as his guest and his intended, Mei Lin, and that any committee unwilling to seat her at the table was welcome to explain that refusal to the 2 neighboring camps' families who would be watching, and to the circuit preacher whose collection plate funded the schoolhouse the supper was meant to build. He had not asked Mei Lin whether she wished to attend before making the announcement, a fact she learned from Bronwyn before she learned it from him, and when he finally came to tell her himself, later that same day, she found herself caught between gratitude and a flare of the old wariness, the reflexive question of whether a man's public gesture on her behalf was truly hers to accept, or simply another decision made for her by someone who meant well. She asked him, standing in the cold outside the flower shack, whether he had thought to ask what she wanted, before he told an entire committee she would be there. He did not defend himself the way she half expected, with an explanation of tactics or timing, or the necessity of striking while the paymaster's wife's cruelty was still fresh in the camp's memory. He simply said that he had been wrong to speak for her before speaking with her, that the anger which had carried him to the committee had outrun his judgment about whose decision this actually was, and that if she wanted no part of the supper, he would go to the committee again and withdraw the announcement himself, publicly, and accept whatever the camp made of a foreman who could not keep his own word 2 days running. It was, she realized, listening to him say it, exactly the kind of answer that told her more about him than the original gesture had, because the gesture itself, however well intended, had been about his anger and his standing as much as about her, but the willingness to unmake it, to absorb whatever humiliation that reversal would cost him in front of the same committee, was entirely about her, about whether she actually wanted this fight fought on her behalf, or would rather choose her own battles in her own time. She stood in the cold considering it, the pendant cold against her collarbone under her coat, and found that beneath the wariness was something else entirely, a fierce and unfamiliar wanting, not to be rescued from Blue Canyon's cruelty, but to walk into that mess tent on her own 2 feet, in front of every person who had crossed the street to avoid her, and simply be seen there, whole, uninvited by anyone but the man beside her, and unwilling to be uninvited by anyone else. She told him she would go, but that he would not need to withdraw anything, because she intended to bring a dish to the supper table herself, cooked with her own hands, using ingredients Pruitt's counter had refused to sell her, but that the cook and Fong and half a dozen quiet allies in the camp had helped her gather in the weeks since, a dish from her mother's kitchen in Toishan that she had been saving, without quite admitting it to herself, for exactly an occasion like this one. Reeves' expression shifted at that, something that was not quite a smile but sat close beside one, and he said only that he would be glad to carry it for her, and they stood together in the cold a moment longer, not touching, the space between them full of everything neither had yet found the words to say plainly, before the wind off the ridge sent them both back toward the fires. That night she began preparing the dish in the cook tent with the cook's blessing, a slow braised pork with preserved vegetables, and a sauce built from ingredients she had spent 3 months quietly assembling one favor at a time. And as she worked, she found herself thinking not of the paymaster's wife or the committee's cruelty, but of her mother's hands doing this same work in a kitchen, an ocean, and a lifetime away. And she wondered, stirring the pot in the flickering firelight, whether her mother could have imagined any version of her daughter's life that led to this particular tent, this particular fire, this particular quiet defiance simmering on a borrowed stove. The charity supper filled the mess tent to its canvas edges. Families from 2 neighboring camps crowded alongside Blue Canyon's own. Long tables built from planks laid over sawhorses and dressed with whatever linen the camp could produce. The circuit preacher already working the crowd with the easy warmth of a man who knew his collection plate depended on it. Mei Lin arrived on Reeve's arm, her braided hair pinned the way her mother had once pinned it for temple visits, the jade pendant worn openly outside her collar for only the second time since the mess tent burning, and she felt the room's attention shift toward them in a wave that started near the entrance and rippled backward through the crowded tables. Conversations pausing and resuming a half-beat late in the particular way a room behaves when it is deciding, collectively and without discussion, how to respond to something it had not expected to actually happen. The paymaster's wife was seated near the head table, and Mei Lin watched her face carefully as they entered, not out of malice but out of the same instinct that had once told her to read Crane's tone before she understood his words, and she saw the woman's composure falter for exactly as long as it took her to recover it. A flicker Mei Lin recognized because she had felt its opposite so many times herself, the effort of holding a face still against what the moment actually demanded. Reeve found them seats at a table near enough the center that avoiding it would have required visible effort, and Mei Lin set her dish down among the biscuits and the venison stew and the dried apple pies with steady hands, though her heart was working harder than the walk from the flour shack could account for. It was Fong, of all people, who broke the room's uncertain silence first, coming forward from where he and the other placer miners had clustered near the tent's edge, unsure of their own welcome, to ask Mei Lin directly, in the halting English he had been building alongside her these past months, whether the pork dish was the one his wife back in Toishan used to make. A question so ordinary and so warmly curious that it gave the rest of the room something to do besides stare. Mei Lin answered him, and the conversation that followed, brief and simple, seemed to loosen something in the tent's collective posture, families drifting closer to the table out of the plain curiosity food invites, even from people uncertain about the cook, and within 20 minutes, her dish had been sampled by enough hands that the platter needed refilling from the pot she had wisely left simmering back at the cook tent. She caught Reeve watching her across the table, not the room, not the paymaster's wife's discomfort, only her, with an expression that made her look down at her own hands to keep her composure, and she thought, watching her dish disappear plate by plate into the hands of people who 3 months ago would not have shared a street with her, that this was not the same as belonging entirely. Not yet, but it was closer than she had let herself imagine possible on a plank floor in November, and she allowed herself, cautiously, to want more of it. Not every heart in that tent softened over a shared plate, and the ones that did not found their voice before the evening ended, when the paymaster himself, emboldened perhaps by his wife's earlier discomfort or simply unwilling to let the night close without registering some objection, rose during the preacher's closing remarks to suggest, in the reasonable tone company men reserved for suggestions they intended as instructions, that the schoolhouse fund being raised that evening ought to specify, in its charter, that it served the camp's American families, a phrasing vague enough to sound like simple prudence, and precise enough that everyone in the tent understood exactly which families it meant to exclude. The tent's temperature dropped in a way no fire could counter. Mei Lin felt Reeve go still beside her, the same stillness Bronwyn had described before the committee confrontation, and she put her hand briefly on his arm beneath the table, not to stop him but to ask, silently, that whatever came next be a choice made together, rather than another gesture made for her without asking. He understood the request, she felt him understand it, the tension in his arm easing fractionally, and when he stood, it was not with the paymaster's blunt instruction in his voice, but with something quieter and, she would think later, more devastating for its calm. He asked the paymaster plainly whether he intended the schoolhouse to turn away Fong's children, should Fong ever have children born in this country, or the cook's son, whose fever a supposedly un-American woman had broken with nothing but bark and patience while the camp's real doctor sat 3 days' ride away. And he let the question sit in the silence it created rather than answering it himself, because he understood, Maylin realized, that the question answered itself in front of a tent full of people who had just eaten a dish cooked by the very woman the paymaster wanted written out of the camp's future. The preacher, sensing the room's mood shift decisively against his collection plate's most reliable donor, intervened with the practiced grace of a man who had diffused 100 such moments, suggesting gently that a house of learning built on charity ought perhaps to specify no family at all, rather than draw lines that would only shrink the number of children it served. A compromise vague enough that the paymaster could accept it without appearing to have lost the argument outright, though everyone in the tent understood precisely what had actually happened. The paymaster's wife did not meet Maylin's eyes again for the rest of the evening. Voss, seated near the tent's rear with the other resentful newcomers, said nothing at all, but Maylin caught him watching Reeve with an expression that had curdled past simple resentment into something closer to grievance, the look of a man cataloging a debt he intended to collect eventually, in whatever coin the camp's rougher justice allowed. And she understood, walking back to the flower shack that night with her empty dish and Reeve's steady arm, that the supper had won them the room but had not won them Voss, and that a man who had already lost a boundary dispute and a public argument in the same winter was not a man who simply let both losses lie. Voss's grievance found its outlet 3 weeks later, not through any confrontation he could be blamed for directly, but through the tunnel his own crew was blasting into the ridge above the grading line, a section of the railroad grade notoriously unstable with loose granite and old fracture lines that every experienced foreman in the camp treated with a caution. Voss, in his hurry to prove his crew's productivity after the winter's humiliations, had apparently abandoned. The collapse came at midday, a section of unshored tunnel roof giving way with a sound Maylin heard from the flower shack half a mile off, a deep, percussive thud through the ground itself rather than the air, and she was already running toward the grading line before the camp's alarm bell finished its first full ring, because some instinct older than language told her that sound meant men buried under rock with very little time before the cold, or their own injuries finished what the collapse had started. 3 men were trapped when she arrived, 2 of Voss's own crew and, to her heart's sudden violent lurch, Jonas Reeve himself, who had been inspecting the tunnel's shoring that morning at the mine owner's request following the boundary dispute, and had been close enough to the collapse to be caught by its outer edge, pinned beneath a beam and a slide of loose rock that had crushed his leg and opened a gash along his scalp that bled with the particular alarming freedom of head wounds that always looked worse than they were, though she had no way yet to know if this one was the exception. The camp's bone setter, summoned at a run, took one look at the scene and admitted, with the honest desperation of a man who knew his limits, that a crushed leg with this much debris still shifting above it was beyond anything he had ever set, and that without help closer than 3 days' ride, Reeve stood a real chance of losing the leg entirely, or worse, if the bleeding from his scalp did not stop and infection took hold in wounds packed with granite dust and torn canvas. Maylin did not remember deciding to take charge of the extraction. She simply found herself doing it, directing the men clearing rock to work from the collapse's edges inward rather than digging straight down, a technique she had heard described once by a mining engineer who had eaten at the cook tent months before and mentioned, in passing conversation she had barely seemed to be listening to, how tunnel rescues in his experience went wrong when panicked crews dug toward trapped men instead of around them, destabilizing what remained of the ceiling. The crew, desperate enough to follow anyone who sounded certain, obeyed her, and within 40 minutes they had Reeve and both of Voss's men clear of the rubble, alive, though Reeve's leg hung wrong in a way that made even the bone setter go pale, and the scalp wound had soaked through 2 settlers' worth of cloth before Maylin got a proper pressure wrap in place. Her hands steady in a way her heart very much was not, because whatever came next, she understood with a clarity that cut through the panic, would depend entirely on what she did in the next several hours, in a camp with no real doctor and a foreman whose leg she was not at all certain could be saved by anyone's hands, including her own. She worked through that first night in the lean-to that had become, by unspoken camp consensus, the closest thing Blue Canyon had to a hospital, cleaning granite dust and torn fabric from the gash in Reeve's scalp with a patience that cost her something visible each time he flinched, despite the dulling tea she had gotten into him, and setting what she could of the leg with the bone setter's grudging assistance, splinting it in a configuration her mother had once described treating on a fisherman whose boat had crushed his shin against a dock, a memory Maylin had carried across an ocean without ever imagining she would need it on a mountainside instead of a harbor. The bone setter, watching her work, admitted quietly around midnight that he had never seen the splinting method she used, and she explained it to him as best her English allowed, and he adjusted his own hands to match her instruction rather than his own training, a small surrender of expertise from an older man to a younger woman that would have been unthinkable in that camp 5 months before, and now happened simply because the leg in front of them mattered more than anyone's pride. Fong and the cook took turns through the night keeping the lean-to's small stove fed, and Bronwyn sat with Mei Lin through the worst hours, holding the lamp steady, saying little, present in the particular way that asked nothing and offered everything. Reeve drifted in and out of a fever-thin consciousness through the dark hours, and in one of the lucid stretches near dawn, his hand found Mei Lin's wrist where she was checking his pulse and held it, not with urgency, only with the quiet insistence of a man confirming something was real, and he told her, his voice rough with the tea and the pain both, that he had watched her direct the rescue from inside the collapse, half buried, certain for several very long minutes that the falling rock had taken more of his leg than it had, and that the sound of her voice organizing the men outside had been the thing he chose to listen to instead of the sound of his own fear. She did not know what to say to that, and so she said nothing, only tightened her hand around his for the length of one held breath before returning to the practical business of checking his splint, because there would be time later, she told herself, for whatever this feeling wanted to become, and right now there was only the leg, the fever, and the long dark hours still between this moment and any certainty that he would keep either. Dawn came gray and cold over the ridge, the tunnel collapse's dust still visible as a pale scar against the granite when the light was right, and the fever, when she finally allowed herself to check it against her own memory of the boy's lung sickness months before, had not worsened through the worst of the night. A fact she allowed herself to receive as hope rather than certainty, because certainty, she had learned in this camp, was a luxury owed to no one, least of all a woman who had arrived here on a debt, and built, plank by careful plank, everything she now stood to lose in a single unstable tunnel's collapse. The fever broke on the third day, and the leg, though it would never again let Reeve walk without a measurable hitch in his stride, held together under Mei Lin's care well enough that the bone setter, by the end of the second week, admitted openly to anyone who asked that the foreman still had both legs, only because of the laundry keeper's splint and her ceaseless watching of the wound for the first signs of the infection that killed more miners than falling rock ever did. The camp's mood toward her shifted again in the collapse's aftermath, more completely this time than after the fever or the boundary dispute or even the charity supper, because a tunnel collapse touched every man who worked the grade in a way that could not be dismissed as sentiment or charity, and the 2 miners from Voss's own crew, who owed their lives to her rescue technique, told the story in the mess tent with a gratitude that needed no translation. Voss himself came to the lean-to on the 9th day, alone, without any of the bravado that had carried him through the boundary dispute, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before he could bring himself to speak, finally admitting, in a voice stripped of all its earlier grievance, that the collapse had been his fault, that he had rushed the shoring against every experienced man's advice because he had wanted, badly and stupidly, to prove something to a camp that had already decided he was the man who lost a rigged boundary fight to a laundry keeper's ledger, and that 2 of his own men, and the foreman he had spent a winter resenting, had nearly paid for his pride with their lives. He did not apologize for the resentment itself, not in so many words, but he thanked her, awkwardly and at length, for the rescue and for the care since, and he left a small carved wooden box on the lean-to's table before he went, a token he had apparently made himself in the long idle hours of his own crew's suspended work, while the collapse was investigated, and Mei Lin understood the gift for what it was, not friendship exactly, but the closing of an account that had run too long unpaid. Ainsworth, the mine's owner, returned to Blue Canyon within the month once word of the collapse and its costly delays reached him, and he questioned Reeve closely about the causes, the shoring failures, the rushed timeline, and the rescue itself, and when he learned the full account of Mei Lin's role, from the tunnel technique to the weeks of wound care that had likely saved his foreman's leg, and possibly his life, he did something none of them expected. He offered her, on the spot, a formal position with the mining operation itself, camp physician's assistant, a title that carried real wages and a standing no laundry contract could ever have granted her, an offer that would have been unthinkable from a company man 5 months before and now arrived as simple, unsentimental business sense from a man who had watched competence outweigh every prejudice the camp could throw against it. Mei Lin stood in the assayer's office holding the weight of that offer, aware of Reeve watching her from across the room with careful, deliberate neutrality, giving her, she understood, exactly the same freedom to decide her own answer that he had given her once before in front of a torn contract, and she found herself, for the first time since the plank floor in November, facing a choice that belonged entirely and uncomplicatedly to her. She accepted Ainsworth's offer, and word of it moved through Blue Canyon with none of the resistance her arrival had once provoked, because a camp that had watched her pull a boy back from lung sickness, expose a thieving assayer, out-document a false boundary claim, and hold a foreman's shattered leg together through a fevered night, had run out of grounds to dispute what she was worth. Pruitt's counter opened to her the week the news spread, not from any change of heart in the man himself, but because refusing custom from the camp physician's assistant had become, even to a man like Pruitt, a foolishness no longer worth the trouble it cost him. And Mei Lin bought her own needles and thread that day with a coin that was entirely hers, earned rather than allotted, and found the transaction meant less to her by then than she might once have imagined, because she had built, in the months since November, an economy of trust and skill that no single counter's opening or closing could touch. Spring came to the Sierra slower than the calendar promised, the snow retreating first from the south-facing slopes and lingering stubborn in the shadowed cuts where the railroad grade climbed steepest. And on a clear morning in April, with the creek running loud with meltwater and the camp's first green showing tentative against the granite, Jonas Reeve asked her, without ceremony, in the same plain voice he had used to ask her name on a November night that felt now like it belonged to some other, harder life, whether she would consider making Blue Canyon not merely the place she worked, but the place she called home. In every sense, a woman could mean that word. She did not answer him immediately, not because she doubted the answer, but because she wanted, for once, to let a decision this large settle in her fully before she spoke it aloud, and she found herself instead reaching up to unclasp the jade pendant from behind her collar, the one she had refused to sell even in the leanest week of that first winter, when a single meal's worth of coin might have tempted a less stubborn woman, and she held it out to him, not as a gift to be kept but as a thing to be understood, and told him the story her mother had told her on the ship's dock in Canton, that jade absorbed the sorrows of the one who wore it, taking damage so its wearer would not have to, and that hers had cracked once, years ago, in a fall she barely remembered, and her mother had told her the crack meant the stone had done its work and could be trusted from then on to keep doing it. She told him she had not been able to explain, in any language he shared until that morning, why she would not sell it even hungry, and that she could explain it now because he had spent a winter proving he understood the difference between a thing's price and its worth, without her needing to say a single word about jade at all. He took the pendant carefully, turned it once in the spring light so the crack caught the sun, and gave it back to her rather than keeping it, saying only that some things were meant to be worn, not held, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life letting her decide which was which, for the pendant and for everything else, and Mei Lin, standing on ground that had once priced her at $300 and now could not have named her worth in any currency at all, let herself, finally, entirely, arrive.